1916, the forces of the crown to take the orange.
Hello, I'm Fraser Myers and welcome to History Matters, a new show which interrogates current perspectives on historical moments. In this first edition, we'll be discussing Ireland's Easter Rising, and we're delighted to be welcoming Kevin Rooney and James Heartfield, authors of a new book, Who's Afraid of the Easter Rising, 1916 to 2016. We're also joined by our WORLDbytes volunteers, Marissa Pereira, Holly Lebrun and Becky Denichik. To start off, let's take a look at a short video commissioned by the Irish government to coincide with the centenary of the Rising.
The grain of 81 starring tequila.
Should I say I'm taking a day now?
Love is fate, rake your way in.
So Kevin, could you give us an overview of the Easter Rising and tell us maybe what's wrong with this strange, cuddly, happy clappy video?
Well, Easter Rising happened 100 years ago on Easter Monday, and it involved about 1,600 volunteers, and they took up arms against the British Army because they wished to declare Ireland an independent nation. And the context is one of British imperialism and colonialism because Britain ruled Ireland at that time. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, in relation to the video, what's striking about Ireland Inspires video, which has the nickname Don't Mention the War video, is that it doesn't actually mention anyone who took part in the Easter Rising, and it resembles more like an Irish tourist board advertising. So it's got the Queen of England, it's got the British Prime Minister, it's got Ian Paisley, but does not have Padraig Pearse, it does not have James Connor, anybody involved in the Rising. So you have a mismatch and a disjuncture, and that's why the video caused such a furore.
I love the video. I think it's a fabulous thing because it shows us just how crazy it is that the people whose job it is to remember this moment 100 years ago, this revolution, which is what it was, a revolution against the British Empire, those people that are organising the events are the people perhaps least sympathetic, even less sympathetic than the people in Whitehall against whom the revolution was made. That's to say, the government of the 26-county Free State, the compromise that was put in place to undermine the goal of a republic that was first set out in 1916. That's why we see them so uncomfortable and unhappy and evasive about the whole thing.
It's very strange, isn't it, to have this kind of avoidance of celebrating openly a foundational event in the nation's history. You can't imagine the French being squeamish about the French Revolution or Bastille Day, or the Americans not talking about their struggles for independence on Independence Day.
Well, I think the Rising's always been marked by ambiguity, and the elephant in the room is partition. The elephant in the room is the north of Ireland, which is still ruled by Britain. It makes politicians in Dublin feel uncomfortable. When the conflict broke out in the north of Ireland post-1969, it put a completely different spin on to the Easter Rising, and hence the sense of ambiguity, of nervousness. The government approached a consultancy firm of advertisers to actually put that video on, Ireland Inspires, and there was such an uproar and fury against it from the relatives of the men and women of 1916, the population more generally, that the government in the Free State and the Republic of Ireland had to take stock And as a result and as a consequence, they then had all sorts of meetings and conferences and came together and actually have rolled out a huge package of different events and commemorations around the Rising. But I think that throws up its own problems, because you've went from a situation of don't mention the war type video to a scenario where the Easter Rising is almost buried in an avalanche of other commemorations and events, so it loses its actual distinctiveness.
And that's what's so interesting for me, is it seems like they've conflated a decade of centenaries. They've conflated so many different amazing moments in history with very different and distinct political imperatives into one quite strange multi-pack.
I think it's really hard if you think of what a commemoration is for. You know, Fraser made this point, which is right. When a country reaches a centenary or some big event, it's ordinary and proper that you should remember that event. So if France is really made by the French Revolution, we celebrate the French Revolution as they did in 1989. But as you say, this weird evasion, this decade of centenaries, mixes up all things that really are against the nation with those that are for the nation. So the Somme and the participation of Irish men in the First World War fighting in the British Army is an important thing, and it should be understood. But it doesn't really all happen in Easter 1916, so there's no reason to be commemorating it in 2016 other than to disguise the meaning of this birth of Ireland through the act of a revolution, of people taking up arms against the British government.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I was listening to a recent programme, a lot of the presenters and people taking part in the discussion were kind of speaking about the leaders of the Rising as if they were sort of mentioning their childhood, how traumatic it probably was. They even went far as saying that Fears, for example, was not psychologically healthy. It was almost like they were pathologizing their behaviour and kind of almost removing the moral agency of those men and the actions they made, but also kind of reducing the key role, I would say, they played to free Ireland.
I think the psychologization of historical figures is actually nothing new. It's been happening for a few years, and it's a trend that I don't welcome, and I don't think sheds much light on historical events. So basically what you have is the effect of the demonization of these 7 characters because of their mothers or because of deaths in their childhood or whatever, to try to explain why the Rising happened. So I wouldn't give it too much credence myself. You have a situation where some people absolutely support and admire the men and women of the Easter Rising, but you have a section of the population, not just Unionists in the north of Ireland, who do not support the men and women of 1916. So when you have the decade of centenaries like the Ulster Covenant, the Battle of the Somme, mixed in with the Easter Rising, what effectively is happening is nothing to do with history, but to do with the here and now. So it's an attempt to try to approach what you might call the politics of reconciliation. You could say it's well-intentioned at one level because they want peace, love and understanding. Unfortunately, what you do is you end up bastardizing history to try to create a scenario in 2016, and you do a disservice to each historical event. One of the things that James and I were very cognizant of when we wrote the book is that we wanted to say very, very clearly that the men and women of the Easter Rising were right. Their aims were noble. They were on the right side of history, and those involved in the Ulster Covenant and those who fought for the British in the imperialist slaughter of World War I were wrong. And right now you'll have very few public figures prepared to call a spade when it comes to declaring what they think of 1916. So what they are is evasive. But that evasion is done in such a way that they use the language of complexity to try and show themselves as these sophisticated historians, when in actual fact, I think it's an evasion of responsibility.
So how exactly have the people involved in Easter Rising been vilified?
First of all, they're called terrorists. In fact, they're called jihadis, and just this weekend I've been reading the papers where they've been put on a par with jihadis of ISIS. And the argument there is that some people say they had no mandate, they didn't have an electoral mandate, which is completely true. And the fact that they used arms and violence at a time when Britain was fighting a war, some commentators say that they stabbed Britain in the back. I think there's a failure to recognise in those criticisms that actually the people, the men and women involved in the Easter Rising, did not see Britain as their country. And I think that's the arrogance of certain British commentators and certain Irish commentators who are, in my opinion, too sympathetic to Britain's position. It's absolutely true, and you shouldn't shy away from it, that the Irish rebels tried to get support from Germany.
But it's quite interesting because the 1918 election kind of endorsed the actions of the 1916 rising. So in a way, the British executed those people who would have been government cabinet ministers.
I really agree. Often people look at the rising as if it was an application for funding from a local authority, that they'd forgot to fill in the right part of the form, they didn't do the consultation exercise, forgetting that this is an event in the middle of a world war, the First World War, in which hundreds of thousands, millions of people were being killed in a grotesque human sacrifice. And it was a war that people of the left, progressive people, had committed themselves before the war. They said, we won't fight. We won't fight for empires. We won't fight for flags. But even despite that promise they'd made themselves, they were confused and disoriented by the fact of the war and the great bloodlust of British nationalism and German nationalism made many people forget their determination not to become cannon fodder. And so there was an awful moment between the start of the war in 1914 and Easter 1916 where there was no real opposition to the war. And this, I think, is the best way to understand what Easter 1916 is as a world phenomenon, which it is, because this is the moment when the dam breaks, when the opposition to the war takes a real form. And people forget that, they know about the Russian Revolution in 1917. They know, some of them know that in 1918, the German soldiers refused to fight and organised a mutiny, which really ended the war. I think people don't often notice that the war ended because ordinary people, soldiers, decided that they would refuse to fight. That revolution against the war began in Dublin in Easter 1916, and that's what the event was. So when you say they had no democratic mandate, they did have a democratic mandate. They had the mandate that the Socialist International had set out in 1913 and 1912 to refuse a penny or a man for the imperialist war effort. And so when Connolly and Pearce and the men and women of the Rising said no and made their revolution against the war, they were realising that dream of a world which was not going to sacrifice its young men.
There are a lot of progressive people in Ireland across the world who do admire the men and women of 1916 Easter Rising, and they admire them because of the fight for independence, freedom and national sovereignty. But one of the things that James rightly said, and we make a big deal of in our book, is even progressive, they underestimate the extent to which the Easter Rising was the first challenge to the barbarism of the carnage that was the First World War.
But that's something I haven't heard before. Even now, with the programme you talk about, it was very derogatory and disregarding of this moment in history. It was called something like a bizarre performance or performance art, this Easter Rising. And yet, as we know, it was something that inspired global revolts.
People don't often look back and see it as it was. Some of the things that were taking place just before the Rising, you have to see, many Irish men did join up and fight with the British with a real reason and purpose, which it proved to be a mistake. But what they wanted to do was to show that they were good and loyal, worthy of self-rule and self-government. But the truth is, as they discovered, that Britain would give them nothing, gave them absolutely nothing. They weren't allowed to have their own officers, they weren't allowed to have their own banners, they weren't allowed to celebrate their own victories. They were used as cannon fodder by officers who viewed them with contempt. So it was a humiliating and a desperate situation. On top of that, there was no democracy. The whole of Ireland was run by this lieutenant governor, was like a colonial setup by the time the war was on. All democracy had been suspended. The Defence of the Realm Act said that you couldn't criticise the war, which was true in England too, and people were thrown in prison for resisting it. So when we say, as people do now, like idiots, they say, oh, jihadis and terrorists and things like this is not true. The terrorists were in Dublin Castle, lording it over the Irish people. The terrorists were the British government in its suppression and domination of Ireland, and they bullied and cajoled and imprisoned and shot and jailed people who resisted them. And that's really is why the Irish people, who in all, measure, you would say were not revolutionaries in their hearts necessarily. They were quite moderate in many respects and often took the more moderate choice where it was in front of them. But every turn, Britain said no, slapped them in the face, refused them even an inch of self-government or sovereignty or respect or even a right to speak. And this is why people rose up. And it's also why when the men did start the Easter Rising, and when all the men and women who were involved in it made the sacrifices that they did and stood up and fought against Britain and held Dublin for more than a week, held the centre of it and resisted the British forces, that was an inspiration. And it was an inspiration which changed Ireland forever.
It's quite interesting because when I was reading the book and how this men sort of fought and were, they wanted to sacrifice their lives for Irish freedom, for self-determination, and of course against British colonialism. But this idea that you can sacrifice for a cause today is unthinkable, where no one is prepared to put their neck in the line for anything, for any cause. No cause is worth fighting for. You saw it with ISIS, for example, where Western leaders were saying it's the worst, the major threat to our civilization, but at the same time, no one is prepared to fight it.
I think it's true. When this again is an inability to look at history in its own time and always to see it through the lenses of the present. And it is true. Modern people are a bit more narcissistic, a bit more comfortable, but with less sense of solidarity, less participation in social and political movements, and a much more individuated way of looking at the world. And people like that look at the Rising and they simply don't understand it.
But what do you say to people that quote Connolly as saying, if I don't get shot, then this is all worthless?
This is the meaning of Connolly's life, is that he knew that there were causes bigger than one man. And when we say blood sacrifice in this kind of snarky way, this is somewhat surreal. There is a blood sacrifice taking place. There's a huge human sacrifice. People are being sacrificed in their hundreds of thousands, in their millions, all along the front line. They're being fed into a mincemeat machine. 200,000 Irishmen signed up for the British Army. 50,000 were killed. Far fewer died in the revolutionary uprising because it was a popular uprising that wasn't about shedding blood but changing circumstances. And I think that's really is why we see it really as a revolution against war. And if he said, it's worth giving up your life to end that kind of sacrifice, I think that's an altruistic and a positive attitude.
You raise another great question, because this is a great debate. I think Connolly would much rather have lived for Ireland. The reality of the situation he found himself in is that they knew that the odds were up against him and there was a good chance that he might have had to die for Ireland. But I don't accept this idea that there were kamikazes and they were going out automatically saying we're dead, finished, end off. I think that they, if you know the backdrop to the actual rising of the countermanding orders of Owen McNeill, there were supposed to be many more volunteers coming out, and a huge percentage of them were not sent out because of confusion sown by a countermanding order, etc. And I think that if you look at the Bureau of Military History, which is the archives which the Irish government opened 40 years after the 1916 Rising, they interview an awful lot of the people involved in the Easter Rising, and what shines through is absolutely the fact that these people didn't think they were involved automatically in a blood sacrifice. They wanted to live for Ireland, they had dreams, they had hopes. But I think James is also right in saying that the odds were not good at that point in time. But I'm like James, I admire Connolly and Pearse and the other revolutionaries for that very fact, in the same way I admire Bobby Sands, a person who was of my own generation in 1981 who died knowing that his hunger strike for political status was up against the odds, but some things are actually worth dying for.
You've written in the book about the fears of commemorating the Easter Rising and the view that it could cause further violence.
It makes me laugh when I think about this accusation, because the very people who are making that accusation are the British politicians. Is there a country in the world more obsessed with history than the Brits when it comes to their wars and their triumphalist sort of commemoration? So that is a deep irony. Maybe a lot of people don't know this, but a good 2.5 years before the commemoration events, the British and the Irish parliamentary group got together, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to wrest control of the Centenary commemoration so that it was in their hands. And one of the things that came out of their first report, they alleged that the 50th anniversary of the commemoration was one of the reasons for the outbreak of the conflict, the Troubles in the north of Ireland in 1969. And I am shocked at the amount of people who are now taking that as a truism. It's an absolute utter balderdash. The men and women who were involved in the conflict in north of Ireland, the modern IRA, if you like, were actually not even rebelling for United Ireland. That came slightly later. They were rebelling against the fact that nationalist Catholics were treated as second-class citizens. They didn't have one person, one vote. They didn't have equal access to jobs, to house, and they lacked political power. And when they went out with the Civil Rights Association that set out a march peacefully, they were beaten off the streets by loyalists and by the security forces. And in response to that, that's why the IRA emerged, when their Catholic areas were being attacked and Catholics were being burnt out of their houses. And then, in my opinion, rightly so, people involved in that conflict thought to themselves, well, actually, the reason why these things are happening is because of the sectarian statelet, that is the 6 counties. And that led to the desire and the campaign and the revolution and the rebellion, call it what you will, for against British rule in the north of Ireland. So that was the reason for the conflict in the north of Ireland. But it is amazing how those with power get to write the history.
You read again and again that Ireland has been under the pall of this nationalist history. They call it nationalist history. Nobody else's history is ever called nationalist history. Only Ireland's is called nationalist history. It's astonishing that really from the word go, the historians in Dublin, put in place by the establishment, always had this view of history that the Rising was a mistake, that it was fanatical. It's always been taught as something odd. The only people that have taught a real nationalist history have taught it from themselves, from the ground up. And those are the people that have reclaimed the story of their own rising as an inspiration, and that's not a bad thing.
There's a really nice line in your book talking about the Irish government today performing an Oedipal revolt against the men of Easter. To me, isn't that what history has always been about? It's always about a kind of revisionism.
I think it's a good question, and I think that if you're talking about historiography and the scholarship of history, new sources become available. It's good to look at things with different perspectives and try to work out causation and so on and so forth. So that's completely fine. There's no problem with that. The term revisionist was a political term used particularly in the 1980s and 90s and to an extent today to describe a particular group of so-called historians who had a particular political agenda. And that agenda was simply anti-republicanism. They wanted to do down the men and women of 1916 as a way of trying to do down the struggle of Irish Republicans in the north of Ireland in the last sort of 30 years during the conflict. It is a tricky question because I certainly would not want to deny those people the right to put whatever spin on history they want. I myself think that in retrospect, the label revisionist historians, which was used almost as a term of abuse against those historians who were trying to pursue an anti-Republican agenda and an agenda against the Easter Rising, wasn't a very helpful term as it happens, and I think it would be good to try and move beyond that. The approach that they use now is to talk about complexity, and complexity sounds ever such a sensible term. But in actual fact, that term itself can be problematic because it moves us into the terrain in which we're at today, where people refuse to make judgments, value judgments about the past. So you end up having a situation today where the Irish government, for example, and lots of historians and people at events say, let's not make any judgment about the men and women involved in the Easter Rising. Let's not make a judgment about the Irish men who fought for the British Army in the First World War, and let's just call it quits, and let's just drown it all with the big backdrop of peace process, reconciliation, etc. Maybe well-intentioned, but not the way to go forward.
What about nationalism today? Do you think that it's kind of pitched as bad nationalism and good nationalism in the world? Do you think there can be good nationalism?
People use the word nationalism and never ask themselves, what are we looking at? And I think there's no easy answer to the question, nationalism, good or bad, because it always depends on what the meaning is of what's being said. When the Easter Rising was launched and the volunteers went into the field, they were raising up a certain idea of a nation which was popular and democratic. That is the real meaning, and you can see the echo today, because the people to whom that appeals are the ordinary people in Ireland who've made this commemoration their own. And it's the popular and democratic that makes the movement of Irish people to free themselves from the British Empire into a positive thing. There are many kinds of nationalism which are the opposite. You know, often nationalism is a flag being waved to drown out popular voices, to silence criticism, as indeed it was for the British Empire. When the British Empire waved the Union flag, what they were really saying was silence, prevent the elections, stop the speaking.
You have this bizarre paradox where, as much as the Dublin politicians and government are afraid of the idea of nationalism, lest it awake the issue of the 6 counties and partition, at the same time, those politicians do claim a sense of legitimacy and a link between the Easter Rising and state formation. So if you look at the creation of the Republic of Ireland, they look back to 1916 Easter Rising as a moment as to when that happened or began. It needs to be pointed out that the Easter Rising was for a 32-county sovereign independent Ireland. In actual fact, what we have is the 26 counties Republic of Ireland, and you could argue that what creates the Republic of Ireland is a counter-revolution, is a counter-revolution that effectively says, right, you are having a partition state, take it or leave it, which was the terms of the treaty negotiations with Britain. I think that Dublin politicians and commentators generally are very afraid of talking too much about nationalism, lest it becomes very apparent to everyone that they're faced with the problem of the fact that many people in the north of Ireland who wish to be rid of British rule still live under British rule.
To what extent do you think this kind of fear of awakening nationalist tendencies, to what extent does that reflect just a kind of contempt for the ordinary public and a fear of them, you know, reacting too much and, you know, in a way that can't be managed by the politicians?
I think that's right at the core of the thing. The reason the mainstream politicians are so scared of this event and so weird about it and so evasive and seeking to stop it or to take control of it is because they know that in truth it belongs to the people. This is a rising which is right there at the beginning, a revolution of the ordinary people, of all the peoples of Ireland, to take control of their destiny. They don't like that democratic spirit and they're keen to silence it.
What really defines the Irish government at the moment is their attempt to control the commemorations, and if they don't have control of it, that's where you see them getting very nervous. I'll give you just one example. Heather Humphreys is the Fine Gael minister in the Irish government responsible for the organising the decade of centenaries and the Easter Rising commemorations, and you had a group called Urigi. Urigi is an Irish name, and Urigi done a protest near the GPO about 200 metres in what you call Moore Street, and this is a street where effectively, to cut a long story short, the men and women of the GPO retreated from the GPO to this street, and people want to make this a national monument. They want the government to buy up these houses and shops so they can build a commemoration. Now these people, Urigi, are Republican socialists. Very much in the tradition of James Connolly, and her response was ban these people, don't let them have the picket, don't let them protest. These people should be kept away from anything to do with the commemoration of 1916. Don't you see the irony here? That people who actually stand in the tradition of Connolly with a bit of radicalism are seen as beyond the pale, and that's because these were a group of people who the Irish government can't control.
It seems to me that the Irish government can't see the Easter Rising for anything other than the brutality and the bloodshed of it. And I think something that the book deals with quite boldly is not a perverse fixation at all on the bloodshed of the Easter Rising, but it doesn't turn it into a pacifist movement. It doesn't hold back from the realities that make it difficult to package, difficult to sell.
There are moments in history when you face hard choices, and the men and women of 1916 made that hard choice, for better, for worse, and we think it was for better. But let's be very clear, innocent men, women and children died. And of course there's nothing wrong with people pointing back to the bloodshed that took place, and it's a terrible and a sad thing. But as you rightly comment, that's not something I think we should shy away from. And to be quite blunt, show me a struggle for freedom anywhere across the world where blood has not been shed.
So how do you see Ireland today, and if sovereignty is still an issue?
I think in all parts of the world, sovereignty is not the issue that it was. You know, there's a much slacker interest in national movements and a falling away of popular participation in national movements, and sometimes we call this globalisation, and that all seems good. You know, you can go anywhere you like, more or less, and get a McDonald's wherever you like. But the way I see it is that the sovereignty question can't go away for Ireland because it doesn't govern itself. The reason there is an Ireland today is because of the Easter Rising, but also that Ireland was robbed. They were robbed of the 6 northeastern counties, and it's a cruel and vicious blow to divide the country, which means that many people who would wish to be in Ireland find themselves under the rule of not very sympathetic establishment based in Stormont and in London. And that defeat of the national movement in the border is a curse on Ireland to this day, and it's thwarted its ability to govern itself freely. The national question has dominated the people of Ireland because of the way that it's been denied. So sovereignty can't be resolved as long as the country is divided. But I think optimistically, what we see again and again is that ordinary people don't accept these circumstances, and though it's not always war, the people of Ireland, as they're expressing in the commemorations and their interest in these events, would wish to be a sovereign people, commanding their own future, as most people would wish to be, and maybe most of all those people who are denied that right.
What I thought was, I'm surprised hasn't been made more of, is that actually it was so progressive in terms of women. I mean, from what other freedom fighters ever have welcomed women to fight alongside them, for one, and from the declaration of Pearse's statement on the steps saying this is for all Irish men and women, equal rights and equal opportunities, that was then echoed in the 1922 Constitution, when women over 21 in Ireland were given the right to vote, which is actually, well, it wasn't until 28 in the UK that women could have the right to vote, and actually hugely progressive. There is
some reason why this history of the revolution has been lost, and that's because of the way that women's rights were clawed back under De Valera's rule, under the development of this truncated state. It wasn't equal opportunity society, but it was in its original aspiration. And when you look at the conflict, it's extraordinary just how much the women's liberation movement in Ireland and Britain was on the side of the rising. When you see Sylvia Pankhurst in her news sheet, the Workers' Dreadnought, is entirely for the rising, and it's not surprising because all of her friends were in the rising. Constance Markievicz was a close friend for Sylvia Pankhurst. These suffragettes were also Irish suffragists. You know, they believed in democracy, and there was nothing strange about that. So when they put the clause in, it's the first constitution ever to include a clause for equal opportunities, and the first woman to be elected to the British Parliament chose not to take her seat, and Constance Markievicz, and sat instead in the Dáil, and that must be telling you something. Whereas the people on the other side, like Winston Churchill, was the same Winston Churchill who, as Home Secretary, had led the terrible assault on the women's liberation movement in 1911 on Bloody Friday, when they clubbed and beat the suffragettes and refused to take prisoners. That was his instructions to the police. He said, just keep beating them. We don't want to see anybody in prison. Just keep beating them until they're gone. This is the people on the side of British democracy.
There was a hell of a lot of radicalism in the Easter Rising, but what happened was when you had the creation of the Free State, the 26 county partition state, which was effectively a Catholic Ireland, a conservative Ireland, a lot of that radicalism was drained from the Easter Rising. But there's a sleight of hand that's at work among certain commentators, and they try to say that the Easter Rising was about producing a Catholic Ireland, a conservative Ireland, when in actual fact the Rising was a very, very radical event. But unfortunately, the forces of conservatism and reaction ultimately won several years down the line after the Irish Civil War and the creation of the Irish partition state. But those two things get collapsed in a lot of the historical versions that you hear at the moment.
So can I just clarify what it was exactly that the Easter Rising was fighting for? Because we get very mixed ideas. To me, it was the total autonomy of Ireland, not the same as the Home Rule, which was kind of a supervised version that they should have waited throughout the massacre of the First World War to get. Was it not a very different thing from Home Rule?
Fundamentally and absolutely different. So Home Rule, for want of a better expression, is effectively devolution. So if you look at devolution that Wales and Scotland has, so at the end of the day, the boss is still Westminster, the boss is London, the buck stops with Westminster. And by the way, when you have devolution, at any point in time, Westminster can take the power back, which it's done several times in the north of Ireland with the devolved Stormont regime. So what the rebels of 1916 wanted was sovereignty, absolute and total freedom and independence, and they're two absolutely different things, and you're right to point out that they mean different things. And so you have John Bruton, who's the ex-Taoiseach, ex-Prime Minister of Ireland, and his stock phrase at the moment is, could the men and women of 1916 not just have waited because we were going to get independence? But no, it wasn't independence, it was Home Rule, and Home Rule is a very, very poor substitute for independence.
Well, and may it be said too that even Home Rule was snatched away, because the minute there was a challenge, the minute Irish people sought to give real meaning to their demand for Home Rule, it became an anathema, and the Tories in the Parliament and in the House of Lords, they said, get lost, Redmond can go to hell. We don't want any part of that, because how is Redmond, this was a real question in the Parliament, they said, how is Redmond going to stick it to all those Irish volunteers as we would wish him to do? Can we have him as a governor of Ireland if he's not going to persecute and torture the Republicans? Obviously not. He's no use to us. So when it came to it, that was swept aside. The very idea of Home Rule was an anathema. I think also we should say it was a learning curve. Irish people with good reason and intent and purpose hoped that they could get the freedom that they wanted within the empire for many years and aspired to it in the ways that Australia or New Zealand had, but learnt that that wasn't on offer. So the people who say, could they not have waited and had Home Rule, are the most deluded of all. There was no way that the British Empire as it was, as opposed to the one that they wish existed, which was a bitter, Tory, aggressive, restrictive empire, was going to give any kind of liberty, was completely absurd.
It seems as if in Northern Ireland today that the British government is in a sense stronger than ever, acting as a kind of referee over these supposedly warring factions in Ireland.
Well, in many respects, I think that's true. I think that, let's be honest, at this point in time, I wouldn't say that there is a fierce or strong anti-imperialist struggle against Britain in the north of Ireland. Personally speaking, that's a long way short from where I would like things to be. But I think one thing that we can do to try to help things is to be honest. And the truth of the matter is, at this point in time, there is no sense of progressive, dynamic, radical politics in the north of Ireland. If anything, things have been fossilised. Now, the irony is some people would welcome the situation in the north, where I would see it as a problem. What I mean by that is you have the idea of two traditions, two identities, two cultures. Some people even talk about multiculturalism, but I think what you have is two sides essentialised into their fixed identities. And that absolutely would be anathema to people like Connolly, who believed in the idea of one Ireland, one united people, beyond Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. So I think personally things are not in a good place at this moment in the north of Ireland.
What can we learn from this event, and is it all about learning?
History works on many levels. This is an anniversary, it's a centenary. People in Dublin and Cork and Belfast, all throughout Ireland, will want to celebrate, which in no other country would be weird. You know, you think like, where does Britain come from? Something to do with Henry VIII, a divorce, and persecuting Catholics. And we make dramas about it every year. Hilary Mantel writes them, we put them on the TV, and they're great, and nobody says, oh, you know, that Henry VIII, he was a bit of a git. It's just like, that's the story, isn't it? So there's nothing wrong with people telling the story of their own country back to each other. I think it's different if you approach it as a historian, to go through the facts and to re-examine the stories and to understand them. I think it's very important, proper scientific objective investigation, which helps us to understand our world. But we should never be beholden to these events in the past, and I think the history is always a usable history in a sense, because in the end, you know, we owe the past nothing. I think much more it's a sense of by understanding what took place and what is taking place and how we understand it and why we're having the arguments we are, that we understand our own situation better. And I think this is the great advantage of this argument about history, is in a way is to free ourselves from a dull and doctrinaire approach and to really make things live, not just so that we can understand then, but also that we can understand now and breathe the spirit of freedom rather than make supplication to the words on the page.
I think that we don't want to be prisoners of history. And I'm reminded of that famous phrase, I think, from Marx, that people make history, but not always in conditions of their choosing. And I think when you look back to the Easter Rising, no doubt there were inspiring moments and inspiring individuals, and I think we can learn from that. And I think that there's nothing wrong with standing on the shoulders of giants. But James is very right, we are where we are, it's 2016, and people today who live in Ireland, north and south, have to work out for themselves how we go forward in the direction of a more progressive politics. That is for the young generation. Let the work begin.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end on. A huge thanks to our special guests, Kevin Rooney and James Heartfield, and of course to our WORLDbytes volunteers, Marissa Pereira, Becky Danichik and Holly Lebrun. If you've got any ideas for our next History Matters discussion programme or would like to get involved, please email us.
And the blackened hands, like lightning ran from the rifles of the IRA.